I'm curious to know how the left has shifted to such an extent. So typically, liberal causes included areas of free speech and free press and freedom. It seems like somewhere in our lifetime, Dr. Chloe, that it has had a profound shift from that typical historical liberalism to environments of
Hmm.
groupthink.
Yeah, I mean, exactly how that, was accomplished, it's hard to say. I mean, there's in some way people talk about the feminization of academia. That might play a role. I've certainly, seen people write about, introduction of Marxism and plans for that over periods of time. The feminization I mentioned because there, I think, can sometimes be a misguided female tendency of nurturance to assume that, it's always best to protect, right? That's one of the things that psychologists, good psychologists, are trying often to explain to parents, or especially to mothers, like, let your sons play fight. Like, it's part of how they develop empathy. And so, maybe, I don't know, as to your point, like, how on earth, did a place like Harvard, get to be the worst in terms of free speech, right? And I went to Columbia. I can tell you it wasn't much better, and that was years and years ago. I can only imagine what it's like now, and they're having, racially segregated graduations and whatnot. So yeah, I mean, how on earth did we get here? That's probably outside of my scope of expertise, but I can see that we are here. That's for sure.
It's interesting during the time of 2020, and I've told this story in the podcast before, I was doing research into the efficacy of mRNA vaccines because I was already a skeptic. I knew the history of the pharmaceutical industries with psychiatric drugs and how trials can be manipulated. Academics can be hired as ghostwriters and how information that could be disseminated that is unscientific. And mRNA technology was new. It's never been anything that's been tested on a human population. We clearly do not have any long term studies for almost all of us. COVID was a very mild flu, if anything. And so the risk benefit analysis never really made sense to me. And so I was doing some comparison on social media, Twitter, for example, and I was building a bit of a following on Twitter at the time. And I got a private message from an academic from Brown, somebody that, I'd also see on CNN from time to time, who was concerned about my influence as a psychologist, where I could potentially dissuade people from getting a COVID vaccine or even wearing a mask based on some of these principles that Chloe you're talking about, but as well as kind of from a scientific background. So I did engage her in some professional conversation to try to get a sense of, what the critical analysis of this was. And what was returned to me was the lack of critical analysis. It is, I think, the definition of groupthink and just following what was presented to them. And that's what I'm concerned about with the psychology profession in a lot of areas, which we can definitely get into. But this idea of like following authoritarian ideals, like somebody, someone's a medical authority, someone's an academic authority, someone's a government authority. They proclaim something to be true, and we follow it blindly. What is your understanding of groupthink and how it actually even develops and
Right.
why it
So,
develops?
the piece I wrote for Fox has the most, detail on this, just in case anyone's looking for, deeper detail on this. But the way I think, and it's interesting you mentioned Twitter, because there's a few elements there. So with groupthink, Irving Yanis, his name is Janis, but I think it's pronounced Yanis. He's the psychologist who kind of coined the term back when, he was trying to make sense of what happened with the Bay of Pigs situation in Cuba, many decades ago. And when he studied that whole, interaction, he looked at the transcripts of the meetings and things because he was trying to figure out how on earth this happened. And one of the things, interestingly, that he mentions prominently as some of the conditions that could lead to groupthink is actually a condition of self-censorship, right? And that can happen, as you said, when we have some kind of a sacred cow or some kind of, incredible expert that we're not allowed to question, which was super weird because science is by definition supposed to be able to be questioned. It's supposed to be, subjected to testing and, proof and revision. And then when that became something that we were not allowed to do, then we had a situation of that, kind of top-down expert situation. And if you disagree, you cannot say so because, you'll be made to look like a fool or you'll be ostracized. But then one of the additional things that was happening in the Twitter files situation that I think really contributed to the groupthink as well is that there was a false sense of social consensus. There was a manipulation, as we all know clearly, it's not even a dispute at this point, that government agencies were colluding with teams, quote, trust and safety teams at Twitter to, censor, visibility filter, like whatever they call it, to the point where your average user who's on Twitter would essentially walk into the town square, look around and say, oh, wow, it looks like 100% of the people feel that anyone who doesn't, mask and vax is killing grandma. And so, good humans to a certain degree actually do take social feedback and, community belonging, a sense of belonging and social norms. And so when Twitter, pre Elon Twitter, did that, they were really setting the stage for groupthink because they colluded with, first of all, this expert class that you weren't allowed to question. Fauci, I am the science, right? And anybody that dared to question him, they silenced. So they created this false, social consensus, and they started messing with our reality testing. And as you know, as a psychologist, reality testing is absolutely key to mental health. And so it's destabilizing when they mess with your reality testing and they mess with your sense of social consensus, and they give you, quote, scientific information, which we've been trained to respect as something that comes from a place of rationality and transparency and testing. But then it wasn't that. It was almost like just calling it by that name, but that's not really what it was. So 100% groupthink recipe, basically, is what that was.
I think it also demonstrates the power of fear and how fear can interfere with reality testing and getting grounded, because that uncertainty and that fear provokes a sense of like profound realization of our own limitations and our pending death. So, I mean, we did see as a culture a profound fear of our own mortality. And in that, you can see how we are, raised tribal. We've evolved tribally. And there was just so much profound, strong, intense anxiety reactions of stepping outside what has been established as normal, even though you might have these concerns and you'd be critically thinking and engaging in conversation. At some point, their eyes would just gloss over and go back to exactly what the messaging was, almost like they couldn't trust their own intuition or their own analysis. And that is, it scares the hell out of me,